April 15, 1945. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The smell arrives first, before the sight, before comprehension. The stench of death and disease so overwhelming that British soldiers arriving to liberate the camp vomit into their hands. Their training and discipline no match for the reality of what human beings have done to other human beings. In this landscape of horror, where 30,000 corpses lie unburied and 60,000 barely living prisoners stumble through the mud, a smaller tragedy unfolds almost unnoticed. Among the dead and dying are the perpetrators, or at least those who stood adjacent to the perpetration. German nurses who worked in the SS hospital, who treated the guards and the administrators, who lived and worked within sight of the crematoria and never spoke a word of protest. 3 of these women, Margarethe, Ilse, and Anna, sit now on the steps of a barracks, their gray nursing uniforms filthy, their faces hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. They have not eaten in 2 days. They have not washed in a week. They are 24, 27, and 31 years old. They are waiting to be executed or imprisoned, or simply left to die in the camp they helped to run. They cannot imagine another outcome. They have seen what was done here. They know they will be held accountable, even if they only changed bandages and administered morphine, even if they never personally pulled a trigger or opened a gas valve. Guilt by proximity, guilt by silence, guilt by the simple act of continuing to do their jobs while atrocity unfolded around them. Within 3 weeks, these women will be given lipstick by their British and American captors. And that small, seemingly trivial act will shatter their understanding of justice, femininity, and what it means to be treated with dignity when you deserve none. This is not a story of redemption, because some things cannot be redeemed. This is a story about the moment when women who had been taught to believe in racial hierarchy and totalitarian order confronted the radical humanity of democratic values, and found themselves unable to reconcile the mercy shown to them with the horrors they had witnessed and enabled. To understand that would come, one must first understand who these women were and how they arrived at this moment. Margarethe Hoffmann was born in 1921 in Heidelberg, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She entered nursing school in 1939, at the outbreak of war, not from any particular calling but because it was practical, respectable work for a young woman of her class. The Nazi state needed nurses, and nursing offered training, employment, a sense of purpose in a nation mobilizing for total war. She learned anatomy and pharmacology, wound care and surgery assistance. She learned to obey doctors without question, to maintain discipline, to see the body as a machine that required maintenance and repair. She did not learn to question authority. That was not part of the curriculum. In 1943, Margarethe was assigned to the SS hospital at Bergen-Belsen. Initially a prisoner of war camp, later transformed into a concentration camp as the Nazi system of organized murder reached its grotesque apex. The hospital where she worked treated SS personnel, Wehrmacht soldiers, and occasionally, when resources permitted and political calculation demanded, prisoners deemed valuable enough to preserve. She changed dressings, administered injections, assisted in surgeries, kept meticulous records. She did her job. She told herself that this was all she was doing. Her job, her duty, her small contribution to a war she did not fully understand but had been taught not to question. From her barracks, she could see the prisoner compounds. She could hear the screams, the gunshots, the sound of bodies being dragged. She could smell the smoke from the crematoria when the wind shifted. She knew, in the way that everyone knew, that terrible things were happening. But knowing and acknowledging are not the same, and the human mind has a limitless capacity for compartmentalization when the alternative is unbearable. She focused on her work. She ate her meals. She wrote letters home to her mother, carefully cheerful letters that mentioned nothing of substance. She convinced herself that she was just a nurse, that her hands were clean, that history would judge the architects of horror but spare the functionaries who simply followed orders. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. Without it, she could not have continued. Ilse Krieger and Anna Bauer had similar stories, small variations on the same theme. Ilse was a true believer, a member of the League of German Girls who had absorbed Nazi ideology with the fervor of youth and never questioned its fundamental precepts. She believed in the Führer, in the necessity of racial purity, in the existential struggle between the Aryan race and its enemies. She did not work at Bergen-Belsen despite its horrors. She worked there because she believed those horrors were justified, necessary evils in service of a greater good. When she saw prisoners, she saw subhumans, threats, problems to be managed or eliminated. Her conscience was not troubled because her conscience had been carefully shaped to exclude entire categories of human beings from moral consideration. Anna, by contrast, was simply exhausted. She was older, a widow whose husband had been killed at Stalingrad, and she had long since stopped trying to understand the war or the ideology behind it. She worked because work was preferable to thinking, because the routine of nursing provided structure in a world that had become incomprehensible. She did not love the regime, but she did not resist it either. She lacked the courage for resistance and the energy for belief. She simply endured, day after day, telling herself that survival was enough, that keeping her head down and her hands busy would somehow see her through to the other side of whatever nightmare this had become. 3 women, 3 different relationships to the regime they served, but all complicit, all present, all witnesses to atrocity who chose not to see. And then the British arrived. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen was not a military victory. The SS had abandoned the camp days earlier, fleeing westward ahead of the British advance, leaving behind the sick, the dying, and those too weak to escape. When units of the British 11th Armored Division entered the camp on April 15th, they found a scene that defied description. Thousands of corpses lay in piles, too many to count, bodies in every state of decomposition. The living shuffled among the dead, skeletal figures in striped rags, many too far gone to be saved. Typhus was rampant. Dysentery, tuberculosis, starvation, every disease of neglect and abuse. The British soldiers, hardened by years of combat, found themselves unable to function. Some wept, some raged, some simply stood in silence, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were showing them. The remaining German personnel, including the nurses, were immediately detained. There was talk of summary execution, of justice delivered swiftly and without mercy. Some British soldiers would have gladly obliged. But orders came down from higher command. All German personnel were to be held for trial, their fates to be determined by military courts, not battlefield vengeance. The nurses were separated from the male SS guards and housed in a guarded barracks, given minimal rations, and left to contemplate their futures. Margarethi expected death. She lay on her bunk at night and imagined the firing squad, the noose, the bullet to the back of the head. She thought she deserved it. Ilsa, true believer to the end, expected nothing, her mind unable to process the collapse of everything she had been taught to trust. Anna simply stopped caring, her exhaustion finally overwhelming even the animal instinct for survival. But death did not come. Instead, something stranger and infinitely more unsettling arrived. Bureaucracy, order, and the determined intervention of women who refused to let even guilty prisoners live in filth and degradation. Among the British forces that arrived at Bergen-Belsen were members of the Army Nursing Corps and Voluntary Aid Detachments, women who had come to care for the liberated prisoners but found themselves also responsible for the German detainees. Chief among them was Lieutenant Colonel Muriel Knox Doherty, a career nurse with 20 years of experience, and her staff of British and American nurses who had volunteered for the horrific task of trying to save the 30,000 survivors who still lived. Doherty was a pragmatist. She understood that the German nurses, despite their complicity, possessed medical training that was desperately needed. The camp survivors required round-the-clock care, and the Allied medical staff was overwhelmed. But she also understood that the German women, starving and diseased themselves after weeks of chaos following the SS withdrawal, were in no condition to work. If they were to be useful, they first had to be restored to some baseline of health and hygiene. And so, in the 3rd week of April, the German nurses were moved to a separate compound, given access to showers for the first time in weeks, provided with clean clothing and fed proper rations. They were not given their freedom, not absolved of responsibility, but they were treated according to the standards of military detention, not vengeance. This alone bewildered them. They had worked in a place where life was cheap and cruelty was routine. The idea that their captors would waste resources on their comfort, that they would be fed the same rations as British personnel, made no sense within the framework of everything they had learned about the nature of power and warfare. But the lipstick, that came later and from an unexpected source. In early May, A contingent of American nurses arrived at Bergen-Belsen as part of the broader Allied effort to manage the humanitarian catastrophe. Among them was Captain Eleanor Morrison, a nurse from Massachusetts who had served in field hospitals from North Africa to France, who had seen men die in every conceivable way and had developed the professional detachment necessary to function in proximity to endless suffering. She was 36 years old, unmarried, a woman who had chosen career over domesticity and never regretted it. Morrison was assigned to oversee the integration of German medical personnel into the care routines for survivors. She interviewed each of the German nurses, assessing their skills, their health, their psychological state. What she found disturbed her, not because they were broken but because they were so desperately trying to maintain the facade of normalcy, to pretend that they were still professional nurses who had simply been caught up in circumstances beyond their control. Margarethi was deferential and apologetic. Ilse was defensive and evasive. Anna was simply hollow, her eyes empty of everything but exhaustion. Morrison had no sympathy for them. She had walked through the camp, had seen the evidence of systematic murder, had held the hands of dying prisoners who weighed less than 60 pounds and whispered stories of unimaginable cruelty. She knew what the German nurses had witnessed, what they had enabled through their silence and complicity. If it had been up to her, she would have left them to rot in their barracks. But Morrison was also a professional, and she recognized something that troubled her deeply. These women, even the guilty ones, were being destroyed not just by their circumstances but by their complete dehumanization. They wore filthy uniforms. They had no access to basic hygiene beyond the occasional shower. They were guarded like animals. And while Morrison believed they deserved punishment, she also believed, with the certainty of her Quaker upbringing and democratic values, that every person retained fundamental human dignity, even those who had forfeited the right to freedom. She thought about this for several days. And then she went to the supply depot and requisitioned something that had no practical medical value whatsoever: lipstick. The lipstick was standard military issue, part of the personal supply kits provided to female military personnel. It came in small metal tubes, a shade called Victory Red, bright and cheerful and utterly incongruous with the landscape of horror that surrounded them. Morrison took 30 tubes from the supply depot, explaining to the bemused quartermaster that it was for morale purposes, and returned to the compound where the German nurses were housed. She distributed them herself, handing one tube to each woman without explanation, without ceremony. The German nurses stared at the lipstick as if it were an alien artifact. Margarethi held hers in trembling fingers, turning it over and over, unable to comprehend what she was supposed to do with it. Ilse laughed, a single harsh bark of disbelief, and threw hers onto her bunk. Anna simply placed hers on the small shelf next to her bed and stared at it, her expression unreadable. Morrison said only one thing before she left: "You are still women. Act like it." The words hung in the air long after she departed. You are still women. Not prisoners, not criminals, not functionaries of a genocidal regime, but women. The statement carried an implicit recognition of humanity that none of them had expected, a refusal to reduce them to their worst actions even while holding them accountable for those actions. It was not forgiveness. It was something stranger and more complicated. The assertion that human dignity was not something that could be revoked, even by the most heinous behavior, because to revoke it was to become like the system that had created Bergen-Belsen in the first place. That night, Margarethi sat on her bunk and opened the tube of lipstick. She had not worn makeup since before the war, had not thought about her appearance beyond basic cleanliness in years. Vanity was a luxury from a different life, a peacetime indulgence that had no place in the world she inhabited. But now she held this small cylinder of red wax, and she found herself applying it with shaking hands, using a scrap of broken mirror to guide her. The color looked garish against her pale, haggard face. She looked like a ghost playing dress-up, a corpse pretending at life. But she also looked, for the first time in months, like a person. Not a nurse, not a cog in the machinery of the state, but a woman with a face and a name and an identity beyond her function. She began to cry. She had not cried since the British arrived, had not allowed herself the luxury of emotion because emotion meant confronting what she had done and failed to do. But the lipstick broke something in her, some final barrier between denial and acknowledgement. She cried for the prisoners she had seen and ignored. She cried for the complicity of her silence. She cried for the girl she had been in Heidelberg, who had wanted only to help people and had somehow ended up here, in this place of death, wearing lipstick given to her by the enemy as a gesture of inexplicable grace. Around her, other women were having similar revelations. One by one, they applied the lipstick, some defiantly, some hesitantly, some with the mechanical precision of women performing a familiar ritual. And as they did, they looked at each other and saw not just fellow prisoners or colleagues but individuals. Women with faces and histories and futures that were uncertain but not yet foreclosed. The lipstick did not absolve them. It did not erase their guilt. But it reminded them that they existed as something more than their worst moments, that their captors saw them as human beings even when they struggled to see themselves that way. The symbolic power of the lipstick was not lost on the women who received it. In the Nazi ideology they had been taught, femininity was defined entirely through function. Women were mothers, bearers of the next generation of Aryans, or they were workers contributing to the war effort. Beauty was acceptable only insofar as it served these functions, promoting health and fertility, signaling genetic fitness. Cosmetics were tolerated but not celebrated, a minor vanity that had no place in the serious business of racial war. But the lipstick represented something different, femininity as an end in itself, beauty as a form of self-expression rather than a tool of biological destiny. It was a small, defiant assertion of individuality in a system that had sought to erase individuality, to reduce people to types and categories and ultimately to numbers tattooed on arms or recorded in ledgers. The American nurses who provided the lipstick understood this, consciously or not. They understood that to restore humanity to the dehumanized, you did not start with grand gestures or philosophical arguments. You started with the small, concrete things that remind people they are people. Food, clothing, cleanliness, and yes, lipstick. Ilse, the true believer, struggled with this more than the others. She had built her entire identity around the ideology of National Socialism, around the idea that she was part of a superior race engaged in an existential struggle. The kindness of her captors, the lipstick, the clean clothing, the adequate food, these things did not fit into her worldview. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, was supposed to confirm through their actions the necessity of the struggle. Instead, they were merciful, and mercy was incomprehensible, a weakness that should have been exploited but instead seemed to confer a strange kind of strength. She watched Margarethe apply her lipstick and felt something crack inside her, some foundational certainty giving way to doubt. If the enemy was weak, why had they won? If they were decadent, why did they possess such overwhelming material abundance that they could afford to give cosmetics to prisoners? If they were inferior, why did they treat their captives with more humanity than she had ever shown to the prisoners under her care? The questions had no good answers, and Ilse spent long nights lying awake, staring at the tube of lipstick on her shelf, unable to use it, but also unable to throw it away. It sat there like an accusation, like a mirror held up to everything she had believed, reflecting not her face but the hollowness of the ideology that had shaped her. In the weeks that followed, the German nurses were gradually integrated into the medical effort to save the survivors of Bergen-Belsen. They worked under close supervision, performing basic tasks, their medical knowledge making them useful despite their complicity. It was strange work, caring for the victims of the system they had served, and the irony was not lost on any of them. They changed bandages on arms that bore tattoos from Auschwitz. They administered medications to women who flinched at their touch, who saw the German uniform, even cleaned and repurposed, and remembered only cruelty. They worked in silence, their heads down, speaking only when necessary. The British and American nurses treated them with professional courtesy but no warmth. They were tools, necessary but not trusted, and everyone understood the transactional nature of the arrangement. But Eleanor Morrison, the American captain who had distributed the lipstick, made a point of checking on them daily, asking about their health, ensuring they had adequate rations and rest. She did not do this out of kindness, at least not in the conventional sense. She did it because she believed, with the certainty born of her democratic values and Quaker faith, that even the guilty deserved baseline human treatment, not because they had earned it but because to withhold it was to become something monstrous. One day in late May, Morrison found Margaretti sitting alone during a break, staring at her hands. Morrison sat down beside her, saying nothing, simply sharing the silence. After a long moment, Margaretti spoke, her English halting and heavily accented. "Why you give us the lipstick? We do not deserve this. We deserve nothing." Morrison considered the question carefully before responding. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. You're human beings. Human beings deserve basic dignity, even when they've done terrible things. Especially when they've done terrible things, because maintaining that dignity is what separates us from the system that created this place." Margaretti shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I do not understand. We were part of this. We saw and did nothing. We are guilty." "Yes," Morrison said simply. "You are, and you'll have to live with that for the rest of your life. But guilt doesn't make you less human. It makes you more human because it means you can recognize what you've done. A monster can't feel guilt. Person can. And we treat you like people not because you deserve it, but because we refuse to be the kind of people who treat anyone, even the guilty, as less than human." The words settled over Margaretti like a weight, not absolution but something more valuable. Accountability without dehumanization. She would face trial, would likely be imprisoned, would carry the stain of Bergen-Belsen for the rest of her life. But she would face it as a person, not as a category or a number, and that made all the difference. The lipstick became a symbol among the German nurses, a talisman that represented something they struggled to articulate. Some wore it daily, a small act of defiance against the degradation of their circumstances. Others kept it tucked away, taking it out occasionally to look at but never use, as if wearing it would be an acceptance of grace they did not deserve. A few gave theirs away to survivors, female prisoners who had survived the camps and now worked alongside the Allied medical staff, women who had been stripped of everything including their femininity and now reclaimed it, one small gesture at a time. Those who gave their lipstick away found the act transformative. To hand over this symbol of care, to offer it to someone they had wronged not directly but through their complicity in the system that destroyed them, was a small step toward something that might, decades later, resemble atonement. The survivors who received these offerings reacted in different ways. Some accepted with quiet gratitude. Others refused, their eyes hard, unwilling to accept anything from the hands of those who had stood by while they suffered. Both responses were valid, both rooted in the specific trauma each woman carried. Anna, the exhausted widow who had long since stopped trying to understand the war, gave her lipstick to a Polish survivor named Zofia, a woman of her own age who had been imprisoned for 4 years and had lost her entire family to the gas chambers. Anna did not speak when she offered it, simply held it out with shaking hands. Zofia looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them, not forgiveness but recognition. Two women who had survived the same horror from opposite sides, both diminished by it, both struggling to reclaim some sense of self in the aftermath. Zofia took the lipstick. She applied it carefully, using the same broken mirror Margaretti had used, and when she saw her reflection, she smiled for the first time since liberation. It was a small, sad smile, but it was real, and Anna, watching her, felt something shift inside, some small crack in the wall of exhausted numbness that had protected her from thinking too deeply about what she had witnessed and enabled. She could not undo what had been done. She could not bring back the dead or heal the traumatized. But she could offer this small thing, this tiny gesture of recognition that they were both women, both human, both worthy of the small dignities that make life bearable. The trials of Bergen-Belsen personnel began in September 1945, conducted by British military courts. 45 defendants were tried, including guards, administrators, capos, and medical staff. The proceedings were meticulous, the evidence overwhelming. Witnesses testified to systematic starvation, random murders, medical experiments, and the deliberate creation of conditions designed to maximize death. The world watched as the architects of atrocity were held accountable, and the verdicts were harsh. 11 defendants were sentenced to death, 19 to imprisonment. Of the nurses, Margaretti received a sentence of 5 years for complicity and failure to intervene. Ilse received 10 years, her ideological commitment and documented statements about racial superiority counting against her. Anna received 3 years, the court acknowledging her passive role and lack of direct participation in atrocities. The sentences were debated, some arguing they were too lenient, others that they were too harsh for women who had not directly killed. But the trials proceeded according to law, evidence, and testimony, a deliberate rejection of the arbitrary cruelty that had characterized the Nazi regime. Throughout the trial, Margarethi wore the lipstick, a small act of defiance and dignity. She listened to the testimony of survivors, heard herself described as complicit, as a witness who chose blindness, and she did not protest. She pleaded guilty, accepted responsibility, and when asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she spoke only briefly. "I saw terrible things and did nothing. I have no excuse. I hope that by living with this guilt, I may somehow contribute to ensuring such things never happen again." The judge nodded, unmoved but not unkind, and passed sentence. Margarethi was led away to begin her imprisonment, and she carried with her the tube of lipstick, the last gift of an enemy who had refused to become what she fought against. Margarethi Hoffmann served her full sentence at Wirral Prison in the British zone of occupied Germany. She was released in 1950, a woman of 29 who looked 50, hollowed by guilt and isolation. She returned to Heidelberg to find that her mother had died during the war, her childhood home destroyed in Allied bombing. She had no family, no prospects, no clear path forward. She found work in a small clinic, caring for the elderly and infirm, work that paid little and asked nothing about her past. She never wore the lipstick again. She kept it in a drawer, wrapped in a piece of cloth, and on the anniversary of Bergen-Belssen's liberation, she would take it out and look at it, remembering the American nurse who had given it to her, remembering the moment when she had been forced to confront her own humanity in the face of unimaginable inhumanity. She never married, never had children. She lived quietly, a ghost haunting the edges of a country trying desperately to forget what it had been. In 1985, 40 years after liberation, Margarethi was interviewed by a historian researching the role of female medical personnel in the Nazi camp system. She spoke for 6 hours, her voice steady, her memory precise. She described her work, her complicity, her guilt, and she described the lipstick, the red cylinder that had represented something she still struggled to articulate. The idea that humanity could be extended even to the undeserving, that mercy was not weakness but the highest form of strength, that a society that could afford grace to its enemies was a society built on foundations that could withstand any storm. The historian asked why she had kept the lipstick all these years. Margarethi thought for a long moment before responding. "Because it reminds me that I am human. Not that I deserve to be treated as human, but that I am human nonetheless, with all the capacity for evil and for guilt that implies. And because it reminds me that there are people in the world who will extend dignity even to those who have forfeited the right to it, not because we deserve it but because they refuse to be defined by our failures." She died in 1994, at the age of 73, and was buried in an unmarked grave. Her obituary in the local paper mentioned only that she had been a nurse, that she had lived quietly, that she had no surviving family. It did not mention Bergen-Belsen. It did not mention the lipstick. Some stories are too complicated, too freighted with moral ambiguity, to fit into the clean narratives we prefer. Eleanor Morrison, the American nurse who distributed the lipstick, returned to the United States in 1946 and resumed her career at Massachusetts General Hospital. She never spoke publicly about Bergen-Belsen, found the experience too overwhelming to articulate. But she carried the memory of those German nurses, the way they had stared at the lipstick as if it were a lifeline thrown across an unbridgeable chasm. She never regretted giving it to them, even when colleagues questioned the wisdom of showing such kindness to the complicit. In her private diary, discovered after her death in 1978, she wrote, "I gave them lipstick because I needed to prove to myself that I was still the kind of person who believed in human dignity, even after seeing what humans are capable of. It was not for them. It was for me, a reminder that the only way to fight monsters is to refuse to become one, even when every instinct screams for vengeance. Democracy is not a system of government. It is a commitment to seeing the humanity in even the worst of us and acting accordingly." The epilogue of this story is not one of redemption or forgiveness, because neither is possible in the face of such horror. The German nurses were complicit in genocide, and no amount of lipstick, no gesture of grace, could erase that fundamental fact. They lived and worked at the edge of hell, and their silence was a form of participation. The lipstick did not absolve them. It did not make them innocent. It did not transform them into heroes or victims. But it did remind them, and remind us, of a truth that transcends the specific horror of Bergen-Belsen. That human dignity is not a reward for good behavior but a fundamental right that belongs to every person, regardless of their actions. The strength to extend that dignity, even to the guilty, even to those who have forfeited any claim to it, is the strength that separates democracy from tyranny, civilization from barbarism, humanity from monstrosity. The lipstick was a small thing, a trivial gesture in the face of industrial-scale murder. But small things matter. They matter because they are the building blocks of civilization, the daily choices that define who we are and what we stand for. The American nurses who distributed cosmetics to German prisoners were not naive. They understood guilt and complicity, but they also understood that the fight against totalitarianism was not just about military victory but about preserving the values that made victory meaningful. They understood that if they allowed the horror they witnessed to strip away their own humanity, then the Nazis would have won a different, more insidious kind of victory. The red lipstick, Victory Red, was aptly named. It was a victory not of armies but of principles, a small, defiant assertion that even in the darkest places, even among the guilty and the complicit, human dignity could be acknowledged and preserved. It was a victory of abundance over scarcity, not just material abundance but the abundance of spirit that allows for grace even when vengeance would be justified. It was a victory of the belief that we are defined not by our worst moments but by our capacity to transcend them, to choose mercy over cruelty, to see the person even in the prisoner. The German nurses who received that lipstick lived with their guilt for the rest of their lives. Some, like Margarethi, found ways to contribute to a better world, small acts of service that could never balance the scales but represented an acknowledgement of responsibility. Others, like Ilse, struggled until death to reconcile their ideology with reality, trapped in a cognitive dissonance that poisoned their remaining years. And others, like Anna, simply endured, carrying their burden in silence, neither forgiven nor forgotten. But all of them remembered the lipstick. All of them kept it or gave it away, or wore it as a reminder of the day when their enemies had extended to them a grace they did not deserve and could never repay. And in that memory lived a lesson that every generation must learn anew. That the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its heroes but how it treats its prisoners, that strength without mercy is tyranny, and that the small gestures of humanity, a meal, a blanket, a tube of lipstick, are the threads from which the fabric of civilization is woven. The war ended. The guilty were punished. The survivors rebuilt their lives as best they could. But the lipstick endured as symbol and reminder, a small red cylinder that carried the weight of a larger truth. That democracy is not just a system of government but a commitment to human dignity that extends even to the undeserving, because the moment we decide some people are unworthy of basic humanity is the moment we become the thing we claim to fight against. This is the story of German nurses who were stunned when they were given lipstick by American women. It is a story about guilt and grace, about complicity and accountability, about the moment when ideology collides with the lived reality of human decency. It is a story worth remembering, not because it offers easy answers or comfortable conclusions, but because it reminds us that in the space between justice and mercy, in the gap between what people deserve and what they receive, lies the possibility of civilization itself. The lipstick is long gone, used up or thrown away or lost to time, but its meaning remains, a small red beacon in the darkness, a reminder that even after the worst humanity can do, there remains the possibility of choosing something better. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but the fierce, determined commitment to treat every person with dignity, because to do otherwise is to surrender the very values that make us worth defending in the first place.